Hi, music appreciation class. I'm back to do a quick video on some questions that you raised in the fifth forum. The first one was dealing with the idea of doubling, and it takes place in the Johann Sebastian Bach Cantata number 140. Just very quickly, Bach wrote, as you know, if you read, he composed in every genre except opera. He never wrote one opera. However, a cantata is a lot like an opera. A cantata is basically it's a musical setting of biblical texts that typically have something in common. So it may or may not tell a story, whereas an opera certainly tells a story. But it's thematically linked. So in this case, the Cantata 140, which is called Awake, a Voice Calls to Us, Bach took a chorale that he wrote that is called Wake Awake, and he wrote 7 movements that intersperse that chorale melody throughout. And each movement is different in some type of format. For instance, one movement may just be chorus, one movement may be for a soloist, one movement may be for a duet. What you're listening to is the first movement, the actual chorus, which you'll hear sopranos, altos, tenors, and basses all singing as one. Now, cantatas also are like operas in that they have an orchestra accompaniment. An orchestra accompanies the voices. When we say the instruments are doubling, what that means is Bach wrote, a soprano line, he wrote an alto line, he wrote a tenor line, and he wrote a bass line. Then, instead of creating whole new parts for the orchestra, he just wrote the same melodic lines for the orchestra. So let's say, I'm guessing, I'm not sure exactly what he did, but let's say he took the soprano line that he wrote for the sopranos, and he wrote the same notes for the first violins. And then for the altos, he wrote the same notes for the violas. And for the tenor line, he put in the cello, and for the bass line, he put in the basses. So all those instruments are playing the exact same notes as the singers are singing. This minimalizes contrast. It's much easier, it's cleaner, it's easier to hear because you don't have 4 new parts on top of those 4 voice parts. They're actually playing the same thing. The only difference is instruments can't sing words like the singers can. This is what doubling refers to. Here, let's listen to just a little bit of it and see if we can point that out. All right, so this is the opening of the cantata. This is just instruments only. And you'll notice right away you hear the instruments playing all different kinds of melodies, different melodies kind of at the same time. This is polyphony. This is a very polyphonic section right here. There's the sopranos. Now in this section, the instruments are not doubling the voices. You still hear the instruments playing their polyphonic lines while the voices are singing their thing. In this section, the instruments are doubling the voices. I could hear the oboes playing the alto. But now the instruments are back to doing their own thing. So don't expect, just because the book says, oh, the instruments double the voices, it may not happen through the whole piece. It may only be sections. If Bach wanted a particular line to be more important and to be understood better, he would double those voices so that so it's more clear. But then when you get into a different section where he wants to be creative, that's when he may write new parts for the instruments. I don't think this is a huge issue as far as knowing something for a test. Just know that doubling simply means when you write instrumental parts, that are exactly the same as the voice parts. That's all that is. The second question was Ritornello principle, and that is a good question. Ritornello, first of all, it's a form. It falls into the category of form. It's a way of organizing sections of music. And if you remember when we first talked about form in one of my earlier videos, I gave an example of ABA form. That means the first section was music that was presented. The second section was different, so we called it B. But then the next section was the same as the beginning section, so we called it A. Ritornello principle is a lot like that. It just means that that A section continuously comes back to us. So in a piece that uses the Ritornello principle, it'll open with a section of music we call A, then it'll change into a different section. Then that first section will come back, then maybe it will go to a different section of music, and then that first section will always come back, because ritornello is the Italian word for return. That means that first section is always going to return. Let me see if I can find an example of the Ritornello. I'm sure it will be in the Bach Brandenburg. Yes, here we go. Okay, so we open with this little opening with basso continuo. Basso continuo was simply the harpsichord and the cello playing their little lower bass parts, and we've got trumpets doing these funky little runs. And right now we're listening to the opening section is just trumpet soloists. And flute soloists. Well, they call it a recorder in your book. It's a type of flute. It's made of wood, though. And oboe, violin. These are all solos. One person playing each one of these. That is the nature of a concerto. Usually alternates between full groups and small groups. Okay, there's that opening section that has returned. This is the Ritornello principle right here. Bach brought that first section back again. And then we've moved into a little bit different music now. Or not yet, but we're fixing to. Now we're in a different section. Here's the soloists again. And you'll hear the dynamic changes. When just soloists play, it gets a little softer, a little... there's that first section again with those trumpets. That's the Ritornello. When you hear that bum, 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 continuously returning, that means that Bach is bringing that first section of music back and alternating it with different sections of music. That's all Ritornello principle is. It just means if we labeled it, the Ritornello section would be called A. All the different sections would be B, C, D, E. So this might be A, B, A, C, A, D, A, E, whatever. But it's going to also always end with the first section. This later on in the classic period, Ritornello principle evolves into a new type of form we call rondo. It's a cleaner form. Rondo means the same thing. It's a return. They're basically essentially the same. The Baroque Ritornello is just a little more complicated than the rondo. I hope that makes sense. Thanks a lot. See you later.